Hello, welcome to North Country History, and I'm Rob Berg. This week, we will take you back to the Northeast for the origins of the lumber industry, and we'll visit the Adirondacks in New York State. So sit back, settle in, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. As I've talked before about the trip I made in October of 2024, I visited Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania. And while I was there, I experienced different aspects of forests, what took place in the Northeast prior to the logging industry developing in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, here in the Great Lakes region. And I've already looked at Maine, the birth of the lumber industry in what became the United States. Today, we're going to go a little bit further west, to the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. Now, New York is, of course, a very large state like Maine, and there's so much history there with logging, the lumber industry, that I really could not cover all of the state. And since it was the Adirondacks that I spent a couple of days in, not nearly as much time as I would have liked to have spent, but enough to give me an idea and the sense of just the massiveness of what could have been a huge lumber industry in New York State. It really wasn't like it was in Maine and what it would become in Michigan or in Pennsylvania, and then, of course, in Michigan. So I decided I'm going to focus on the Adirondack Mountains. It's a very popular place. It's beautiful. It's the largest state park in the United States. It's one of the largest public land holdings in the United States as well. So today, that's what we're going to really focus on is the Adirondacks, and there are connections there to Michigan that I've brought up briefly in the first season, and I will mention that again today. But just so we have a little bit of the idea of what Adirondack Park is and why it is such an iconic place is Adirondacks has about 6 million acres of land there within the boundary of the park. But unlike most state parks or national parks, it's not all publicly owned land. It's a mixture of state and private land. I have an article here I found online, A Gift of Wilderness, the Adirondack Park, and it's from wildadirondacks.org. So you can find that on the web. And it was really a creation to try to keep the Adirondacks or to preserve them to become what it once was, to try to return it to that. And it's a mixture of state land and private land. There's about 2.6 million acres of the 6 million acres is owned by the state of New York. So that's the public land that is free to available to use. There's parks, mostly forest lands, but it has mountains. It has the rivers. It's the watersheds for many rivers, including the Hudson River. But it also includes private land of about 2.9 million acres. So that's the people who live within it. There's many communities within Adirondack parks. And then there's a lot of privately owned land, still lumbering happening in there, but to a much smaller scale than what it was in the 19th century and even up through the mid-20th century as well. The rest of the acreage is water. There's a lot of lakes. There's about 3,000 lakes within the Adirondack State Park. On the website here, on the article, it says the region has over 3,000 lakes, 30,000 miles of rivers and streams, 42 peaks of over 4,000 feet. The Adirondacks are kind of really their own separate mountain range. They are not geologically connected to the Appalachians, which are very close by, but they're not considered part of the main chain of the Adirondack or of the Appalachian Mountains. And it has a wide variety of habitats, including unique wetland types and old-growth forests. Now, the forests are, the old growth in there are a very small percentage of what the forests are there now. The park was created in 1892, and that was based on surveys that had been conducted 20 years earlier, and realizing that we need to do something to save this. This land, this park this area is not going to continue to be a wilderness. And in fact, it had mostly not been anymore. The first logging that took place in the Adirondacks really took, the documented, I should say, is the 1760s. The first sawmill in the region was just south of Lake George in the eastern part of the Adirondack Mountains, built in 1764 by a man named Moses Clement. Another one was built in Essex County, which would be west of Lake Champlain, and that was in 1767. And those were the areas that were kind of in that contested region. If you know your American history from prior to the War of Independence, there was the French and Indian War. Took place 1750s up until about 1761. And in that war, the French from Canada and the British in New York were contesting for that area along the Lake Champlain, Hudson River area, and along with native allies from both. The French had mostly the Algonquian native tribes, many coming from the Great Lakes region, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and others, along with the Huron or Wendat, which were Iroquois. But then the the British, they had a lot of Iroquois native allies, and many of those came from the Hudson and Mohawk River regions or valleys. And this was the kind of the contentious area, and the British, of course, eventually won. Canada became part of British possessions, and of course the American colonies remained British until, of course, about 20 years later, when the American War of Independence broke out, 15 years later, and which we're now looking at the 250th anniversary of that happening now. So this was always a contested area, and there was settlement coming up the Hudson River Valley into the Adirondacks already at this period, but very small amounts because the French had possessions at Crown Point on Lake Champlain, and then later Carillon, also known as Ticonderoga, where they had forts and there were battles fought there. And the British were down at Lake George, and so it was very much a contested land. And there were some hardy settlers, and also across the Lake Champlain in what's now known as Vermont. It was kind of an unorganized territory claimed by both the New Hampshire and New York provinces at that time. But so like other areas, there was contested on the frontier, and there were those settlers who came early. And lumber was a good attraction, just like in Maine and New Hampshire. Lumber was what drove a lot of the migration, a lot of the settlement in this area. It was not very good soil for farming. Much of the rest of New York State, further south and to the west, would be found to have very fertile farmlands, and the forests were cut there, but not for a lumber industry, but for the settlement of farms and communities there. And we would see that here in Michigan, and here in southern Michigan, the hardwood forests fell to the axes, not for lumber purposes, but for farms and settlements. And the northern forest, the pine, that was what drove the economic industry, just like in the Adirondacks in Maine, and what we'll see with the next episode in Pennsylvania. The white pine, Pinus strobus, the eastern white pine, as I've talked before, pine was king. It was the green gold that drove the lumber industry, not just in the Great Lakes region, but also the Northeast. And that was no different here in the Adirondack Mountains. There was also lumber that was found of spruce, white cedar, and hemlock. Spruce would take hold later when paper mills would start to spring up in the region, and the pulp from the spruce would be found to be very good for that. Likewise, cedar was good for various uses. Hemlock was more so for the bark originally, the tannin in hemlock. It was you strip the bark, you take the bark to tanneries for the conditioning of animal hides into leather, and it was the tannic acid in the bark, also wood chips in hemlock and oak, that would be used for that solution to make it into the pliable material of leather. So these were kind of the ones that were used, not the hardwood, because as we've mentioned before, hardwood or maple, oak, beech, elm, they don't float well. So with all the rivers in the Adirondack Mountains, that was the easiest transportation, just like here in the Great Lakes. So you floated logs down the rivers, you cut the logs that could float, you didn't cut the ones that could not float well. So the logging industry in New York, it began late 1700s, local use originally, and a little bit of beyond that, cutting in the sawmills. And they were located on lakes where you could then raft the lumber down to other locations along the lake or at the ends of the rivers, of course, too, to do that. And the way they moved the cut lumber was not like what we did on the Great Lakes on lumber schooners going across the lakes to other areas, but on big rafts. And the same thing they did in Maine as well on the Penobscot River, where the mills were located farther up from Bangor. They went down, rafted them to Bangor to where they could load them up on ships for further transportation. Well, here they would, raft them down the rivers to the Hudson River, to the Hudson River, down the Hudson River to the Albany, and there they could load up onto ships that way. So they did that, and there were a number of other rivers too. The original usage of the rivers dated back really for a major industry to the early 1800s, and they started to recognize, the state of New York did, for navigable rivers used for public highways, not for transporting people on the river, such as the Hudson and the Mohawk River, but for as I mentioned, the lumber, floating them down to the sawmill. So you had in 1806 the Salmon River in the Adirondack Mountains, followed by the Raquette River in 1810, would be designated as these navigable rivers. So they were then develop the river so they could easily move the logs and move the lumber rafts, creating new channels, digging out any obstacles out of there, deepening them, just as we would for the river drives in Michigan, about 50 years later. So you can see early happenings in the eastern states that would then come along to look at what we were doing in Michigan and the rest of the Great Lakes region, 50, 60 years later. And where they were doing it here up through the 19th century till about the end of the, railroads in New York actually came into for logging later than it did in Michigan by about 10 years. So you're looking at, they were using the rivers solely until the 1880s. But in Michigan, as I mentioned before, we were started to do that in the 1870s. Many things happening in New York that would predate what the same thing would happen here in Michigan. Here in New York in the 1860s, so we're looking, been around the logging in New York and the Adirondacks had been happening for a little while. It had really started to take off in the 1820s. So you're looking at almost 40 years later, logging industry in New York had really grown. and it had started to decimate the landscape, just like it would everywhere. And with New York here, with the logging taking place in the Adirondacks, the Hudson River was really the lifeline for New York. I mean, it was fought over in multiple wars in the 1750s, in the 1770s, and again in the early 1800s, the War of 1812. Never quite made it that far to the Hudson River, the War of 1812, but it was something that there was competition between the different belligerents. And it was the highway for this region. And that was the great supplier for lumber going down the Hudson River, first to Albany, but then continuing down to New York City. And from there, around the Atlantic coast. Same way where Michigan's lumber would come through the Erie Canal from Buffalo along the same route as the Mohawk River, and then to Albany and to the Hudson River. And because of the close access of the Adirondack Mountains and with the lumber there, the area was really becoming devastated. And so here I want to, from environmentalist George Perkins Marsh, who I visited his homestead where he was born in Vermont during my same trip. And he understood the danger of deforestation. He wrote in his book that he, I don't have the name of it in front of me right now, but he wrote this in the 1860s. We have now felled forest enough everywhere, in many districts far too much. Let us restore this one element of material life to its normal proportions, and devise means for maintaining the permanence of its relations to the fields, the meadows, and the pastures, to the rain and the dews of heaven, to the springs and rivulets with which its waters down to earth. The Adirondack was a source of watersheds for many rivers flowing down to the Atlantic Ocean via, as I mentioned, the Hudson River, along then the rivers that flowing into Lake Champlain, and up the Richelieu River to the St. Lawrence River and out to the Atlantic that way. And then there were the ones that flowed directly to the St. Lawrence, north and northwest of the park, and even some that flowed further west to Lake Ontario. All of these were major watersheds, and yes, they all went to the Atlantic. They were part of the Atlantic Basin, but they were followed many different, or included many different ecosystems. And without the forest to protect these waterways, these riversheds, life everywhere around them was endangered, but it was affected by it. And with the restoration of the forest as a protection, it would then allow for these areas to become healthy again. And we see that everywhere where logging takes place, and with the conservation, the reforestation afterwards, that we will try to start to heal it. And there were surveys that were done in the 1860s and a push beginning in 1872 to create a park of some sort in the Adirondack Mountains. And the New York State Assembly did eventually establish the park, Adirondack Park, in 1892. So it took about 20 years for this to happen. But there was a state law in 1885 that created a forest commission that really didn't do much to be able to protect the forest, to protect the park. There was still a lot of logging that took place. But as we saw in Michigan to come, it happened in New York as well, and it happened really everywhere where logging is that once lumbermen were done with the land, when they cut the trees, most of it was deemed to be useless to them. And of course, when you don't pay taxes on your property, that property can be seized in lieu of the taxes. And it happened. The lands were forfeited back to the state of New York in many places. And there was all this public land that was being established, or that was taking hold in the area of the Adirondack Mountains. And with the 1892 act that created the Adirondack Park, it said, such park shall be forever reserved, maintained, and cared for as ground open to the free use of all the people for their health and pleasure, and as forest lands necessary for the preservation of the headwaters of the chief rivers of the state, and a future timber supply, and shall remain part of the forest preserve. So that actually not was just for the Adirondack Park, but also the Catskill Mountains down in southern New York, which was properly part of the is properly part of the Appalachian Mountains. And so you could see the creation of these taking hold at the same time. And they considered this as the Forever Wild Clause, and it was included in a new state constitution in New York in 1894, so it was permanently enshrined in the Constitution for the state of New York. So the question is then, did this end logging in the Adirondacks, and was this park then permanently saved? And the answer to both of those is no. No, logging did not end at that point. With the original, what they call in some of the publications, the blue line, the original boundary of the creation of the Adirondacks, there was actually very little state-owned land within that region. It was mostly privately owned. As I mentioned, there are communities located within the park. Some of them were well established by this point, but for a lot of it, it was privately owned industrial land, or, really it was timberland owned by logging companies. And there were mills along in there on the waterways, particularly on the lakes. And this was 1892, and railroad logging had begun in the Adirondacks right around 1884. So they were quickly cutting the trees. With the railroads, you had to cut everywhere, everything, to maintain the costs of it. But of course, as mentioned in last season with the logging in Michigan, is that with the railroad, you could also cut everything. You could cut the biggest trees, the smallest trees. You could cut softwoods, your conifers such as pine, hemlock, cedar, spruce. But you could also cut oak, maple, elm, beech, basswood, all of these hardwood trees that were of value, but previously were not economical because you could not move them easily on the rivers. So you could see the quick loss of forest lands during this time period, a part of it which sparked the creation of the park, but also saw that the need that they've got to do something better to enforce this. And the Forestry Commission was not the way to go, but the creation of parks did allow that to happen. And they did establish forest nurseries during this time period. Mentioned in Michigan, we had the Higgins Lake Nursery and Forest Reserves in 1903. Well, the first state nursery in New York did not precede Michigan very much before that. It was 1899, opened on Tupper Lake. And then there was also another one opened in Saranac in 1903. So these were regions that, where it was kind of the heart of the logging. And at the same time in 1903, a 3,000-acre tract of forest that had burned on the east branch of the St. Regis River. This was all in kind of the northwestern part of the Adirondacks. It was replanted with nearly 4 million spruce and pine trees. And they matured, it says here, within 30 years. On pine plantations, they will mature faster than in an old-growth forest. But the trees are not going to, the properties will not be the same between a plantation forest and an old-growth forest for how the trees grow, the strength of the lumber. Plantation forests can be harvested much quicker the way they're grown, but they're also not going to be that great timber, the 200 feet tall or 150 foot tall trees even with 4 to 6 foot diameters. You're going to be logging them at about some of them as small as 12 inches diameter, but also those going, upwards of maybe 24 inches, 2 feet diameter. So they're growing faster, but the lumber is not the same strength with that quicker growing. But anyways, digressing a little bit there, we'll get into more forestry specific topics later into the podcast in episodes. But with the logging continuing, but with the creation of the park, the reforestation efforts beginning, protection, there was also recreation. And, we've heard of the Adirondack camps, these great, almost palatial private camps found in the mountains. And, the likes of the Rockefellers and the Roosevelts, the Vanderbilts, they all would go up to the Adirondacks during the summertime. In fact, in 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt was vice president and was vacationing in the Adirondack Mountains, President William McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, and Franklin Roosevelt, wrong president. Theodore Roosevelt was climbing, I believe it was Mount Marcy, the tallest mountain in the Adirondacks at that time when he was notified that McKinley had been shot and he had to rush to Buffalo. And it was on his route on the train that when he was en route that McKinley died, and Roosevelt officially became the newest president of the United States. Having these private camps, not only for the wealthy to be able to vacation in the Adirondacks, but also even more modest camps, and having the burgeoning middle class being able to vacation did also help to lead to the protection of the Adirondack Mountains. People were coming there and they were spending their money there. And with the lumber industry declining as the forests were denuded and the companies would move on, the replacement for these for the local economies was with recreation, with tourism. It was a very small trickle at first, but as the state invested in the land, replanting of the forests, and with the additional ownership of property, there would be more property that would come into the state ownership as more lumber companies got out of the business. Some of them did sell their lands to other private firms, either for industrial purposes or maybe for settlement. But that was a way then for the growth of the park over time. But still, it was even for quite a long period that the state did not own a lot of land there in the Adirondack Mountains. And driving through is very unique. And as I mentioned, I was there in October of this last year. And, knowing that I'm in this huge park, but, going through small towns, going through Blue Lake, going through Long Lake, Indian Lake, all these different towns there, not all of them were named after the lakes they were on. Newcomb, which is a nice little town. And unfortunately, the Adirondack Park Visitor Center located in Newcomb was closed on the day I was there because they were closed on Mondays. And that was the day I was there. So I walked around a little bit, but I wasn't able to get into to learn more of the history and the natural history of the park through the interpretive center. But it was nice to kind of get around the feel of what it was like there. And I camped in the park. So I did spend my money in the park and had to buy gas and buy ice and food while I was there in the Adirondacks. And had the weather not been rainy, it was a very wet overnight stay I had. I actually slept in the car instead of setting up my tent. But I would have spent more time. I would have did more hiking than I did. But yes, it was, tourism is what the Adirondacks have now started to embrace there. And, this is, again, something that it's happened everywhere where logging happened. In Maine, the Great Woods of Maine, the North Woods there, that has become a lot of tourism. There's still a lot of logging going on in Maine as well. I didn't really touch on that in the episode because I wanted to focus on the very birth of the industry there in the 18th century. But in the modern period, Maine still has a lot of logging, but there is now also the Maine Woods National Monument right next to Baxter State Park, which is a huge state park there. But still, most of the Maine logging or forest regions is privately owned. And the Adirondacks still has that great mixture of almost 50% privately owned to about 44% of state-owned land. So you can see that these ways of partnering between private and public ownership will help to maintain these forests. We're seeing that in Michigan, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, that is still mostly forested land compared to what is not. And a lot of the land has been owned by lumber companies in the Upper Peninsula, and many of them are getting out of that now, and some mining companies too, where they were mostly interested in what was underground. But now the different land conservancies are getting involved with the ownership of the land and trying to protect it more. So what's happened in the Northeast is happening in the Great Lakes. It's happening further west. Of course, out there, a lot more of that is federally owned land. In Michigan, we have a lot of national forest land too, with the Huron and Manistee National Forests in the Lower Peninsula and the Hiawatha and Ottawa National Forests in the Upper Peninsula. In Wisconsin, the Chequamegon and Nicolet National Forest. I'm sure I mispronounced both. My bad, Wisconsin. I'll be out there in August, and I'll make sure I learn the correct pronunciations. And in Minnesota, you have the Chippewa and Superior National Forests. In Ontario, there's a lot of provincially owned crown land that is protecting a lot of the land there. And of course, there's also provincial parks, Algonquin Provincial Park. There's also Lake Superior Provincial Park and national parks along Lake Superior where there's preserving a lot of the forest lands too. So that all the this public ownership of land is very important for the preservation of it. But it's where also the privately owned land is help to maintain the economy for the region, to allow people to live there, to allow tourism to take place. In a year or two down the way, we'll have many more episodes about Ontario. I'll be visiting there, and I have a friend in Elliott Lake, Ontario, where I'll base with him, and we'll go out and explore a lot of the regions. And so that's looking further down the line. So you can see we are getting out and around. And right now, we're looking again at the Northeast. And with what was happening here in New York, along with Maine, with Pennsylvania, that I will touch on next week in the episode on Penn's Woods. But these all predated what was happening to the Great Lakes region. Some of it was happening concurrently, but usually the original steps of the logging technology or with the needs for conservation practices were happening first in the East, where they started it first and then moved to the Lake States. And then from there, they moved to the South and they moved to further west as the industry evolved. So back to hear some final words on New York with this is that, just like in the Great Lakes region, the Civilian Conservation Corps did great work coming into into New York during the Great Depression, and having Franklin Roosevelt, the president now at this point, now we bring him in. It was his administration that created the CCC in 1933. So, of course, there would be several camps located within the Adirondack State Parks or Adirondack Park. And initially, there were 4 CCC camps built in the Adirondacks in 1933. Fish Creek Pond in Franklin County, Bolton Landing in Warren County, Eighth Lake in Fulton County, and Speculator in Hamilton County. Now, in the notes here, the podcast notes, I'll mention all the counties that encompasses Adirondack Park, so you can get an idea of what we're looking at. But they did work in improving and developing campsites and trails, stream improvement, and reforestation. Pretty much the same work that they were being done here in Michigan as well. But from in 1935, the CCC camps in New York State increased to 106 from 69 the previous year. And they were all required to be temporary structures, which is what mostly was the case with the CCC. And they did not require the clearance of timber. So that was part of the state law allowing the CCC to take place in New York because they didn't want any more permanent camps created while they were doing the work of, kind of restoring the wilderness or restoring the outside. So this was, as I mentioned, very important to what would happen here. And so, there were just amazing the work that they've done in there to restore the wilderness in the Adirondacks. There is a large area called the High Peaks Wilderness, located kind of in the central part of New York, or of the Adirondack Mountains, where there's no roads go through there at all. I mean, where I was at in Newcomb, that was right on the kind of the cusp of the high peaks. Go to the north, there's a large roadless track that continues all the way up to where Lake Placid is, famous for the 1980 Winter Olympics. And to get there, you have to go a long circuitous route. And that would take you through the area of Keene, New York. And I almost failed to mention Keene, but when I had my episodes on DeWard and then David Ward with his one timber cruising expedition, he was a native of the Adirondacks. He came from Keene, New York, where his father had been a timber cruiser. Working in the Adirondacks. Keene is located in northeastern part of the Adirondacks, not terribly far from Lake Champlain, so the eastern edge of the park, what became the park. And, his family was in the lumber trades in New York there. Also farming, but, farming then was mostly for subsistence for yourself, provide food for your own table, maybe sell a little bit extra, but it was not a big farming agricultural area. But during the winter season and then other times of the year, David Ward's father would do some timber cruising. And with Ward, he was born in the 1820s, and as a young boy, old enough to go with his father, but still not old enough to go out on his own yet, he would travel with his father on some of these timber cruising expeditions there in the Adirondacks. And then eventually, when his father had some clients who had come from New York out to Detroit and to Michigan, he was hired to go out and do some timber cruising in Michigan. And they did that, and it was in the area of the Thumb region, where they were located out of what was then called Newport, Michigan. It's now Marine City. And that was where they ended up deciding to settle in Michigan, along with a number of brothers that he had, that some of them were in the lumber industry, but many of them went into other industries out there or out here in Michigan, in the Great Lakes, shipbuilding, fishing. Those were other industries that they got into. Steel making, even. Eber Ward, a cousin of David Ward's, he started the first steel industry in Michigan. So you can see that the Ward family, coming from the Adirondacks, came to Michigan, and they ended up kind of into very diverse industries. David Ward being the most notable for the lumber industry, Eber Ward for shipping and steel building or steel making. So there's a great connection between New York and Michigan. There were a lot of other lumbermen who came from New York State. Many of them started further east, New Brunswick and Maine, stopping in New York and Pennsylvania, and then making their way to Michigan. So there's these connections here. We never like to say that it happened like this and, a firm way of doing it. But no, it happened in many different ways. And they change, they evolve as, they're going to different locations. They're experiencing different things. And, that happens in every field in history. But lumber, forest history, just the same. We happen to have very similar forests in the Northeast and here in the Great Lakes region. So it seemed perfect that, this was an industry that would carry over very easily between our two regions. So hopefully you learned a little bit about with the Adirondacks and the logging that took place there. And I do encourage that if you have not gotten a chance to visit the Adirondacks, to do so. And try to spend more time than I did. I was on a fast vacation. I mean, I was out in the East for 10 days, but I only had 2 days to spend in the Adirondacks, which is not nearly enough. Next time I go, I'm going to spend several days there and maybe move around from one place to another, or maybe just stay in one place and explore it. And unfortunately, October is not the best time if you want to hit museums. As I mentioned, the Adirondack Park Interpretive Visitor Center was closed the day I was there. But also the previous week, the Adirondack Experience, the museum in Blue Lake, closed for the season. And that's supposed to have some wonderful lumber and forestry exhibits in there. The state park campground, the Louis Lake, that I stayed at on the evening of October 13th to the October 14th, that was the last night they were open. Being in the mountains in October, you have to worry about cold temperatures hitting early, so needing to shut off water. I mean, same thing happens in Michigan. The Upper Peninsula campgrounds in the National Forest, they close right around that same time, October 15th or so every year. So, seasonally, you got to look at that. And of course, a lot of the hotels, the resorts are closed for the season come that point, even though it's still fall color season. But you have to look at, the weather changing quickly. And while I was out there, not in the Adirondacks at that time, but had moved on to New Hampshire and to Maine, they got snow in the Adirondacks. So, that happened. So visit if you can. I encourage you to, but also look at the calendar when you go. And of course, winter is a beautiful time if you're doing winter sports. But be careful in the mountains. In the same region near Newcomb, there was a hiker that was lost this past winter. I never heard any further if they were able to recover him, but he was missing for a number of days, presumed lost, presumed dead. So it can be dangerous when you go. So be smart in the mountains, and especially if you get into the wilderness area. But it is a way to kind of get an idea of, of what it's like. I embrace forest history, not just for the old historical park, but for what we have here again. So thanks for listening. And next week, come back and visit me or visit with us for Penn's Woods, the lumber industry in Pennsylvania, and how that will be the next step to the Great Lakes. So thanks again, And this is Rob. And as always, listen, download the podcast, share it with others, and tell a friend. It's the best way for us to grow. So thank you again for listening to North Country History. And this is Rob Berg. Goodbye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.